resume.
Mr. Commissioner, I know Mr. Timberg is just about to start again. I just thought I would just identify that some of the estimates for time for questions of Mr. Grout this morning have gone up somewhat. I'm still optimistic that if everyone's efficient and council adjusts and are as efficient as they can, that we should be able to complete this evidence today. Mr. Timberg?
Good morning. Mr. Timberg for Canada. If Mr. Registrar, if we could go back to Exhibit 481, please. And then page 25 of 36. Mr. Grout, when we finished off yesterday afternoon, we were on this document, Sustaining America's Fisheries and Fishing Communities, and I was wondering if you could explain some of the helpful points in here with respect to ensuring fairness for fishermen and communities.
Well, one of the concerns, I guess, that have been identified around the movement to catch share sorts of programs, or the effects that those systems might have in terms of effects on fishermen and employment, coastal communities, things like that. So the report does identify a number of the concerns related to those specific issues, as well as some of the ways that the design of catch share style programs might be able to address some of those concerns.
Okay, and at page 24 of 36, there's a table. And is that, can you help us out as to whether this table of concerns and different design options is of assistance?
Well, I think a general point needs to be made that these catch share programs are different depending on the fishery, and the reason for that is there are a number of different ways you can design them. And so what this table is showing are examples of potential public interests in how the catch share program is designed, and potential ways you might consider addressing those in how you design the fishery. So the first one relates to the historic industry structure. For example, concerns around keeping small boat fleets active in the fishery. Some of the design elements around that have been worked on are concentration limits on how much quota, for example, might be held to maintain some level of participation, maybe maximums on the amount you can lease. They've also done other things on having vessels catch a certain amount before they're allowed to access more quota. Other issues here around stewardship. And that point I raised about catch limits and the monitoring elements of the program. We've got localized management and economic benefits. So this is, you can look at how the trading works across zones and maybe even historic gear types, and setting up limits around those. Provisions to have owners on board in some cases, various other things. On the other side of some of those are the economic efficiency, and there are those that would argue that you should allow as much transfer as possible so the fishery is economically efficient, and so various rules around those. Finally, around government and bureaucratic costs, there may be minimum or sizes of trades that will be allowed, so you're not having a whole bunch of transactions for very tiny amounts of quota, for example. How much role does the government have in the trades? Is there an independent source or board or marketplace for where the trading can occur? Those sorts of ideas. So there's quite a bit of different design options that can be explored in these programs to address a variety of the concerns that have been raised.
Thank you. Can you describe the Mr. Dennis Brown testified on Tuesday, and he raised concerns about share-based management and possible problems with concentration by corporate interests. Could you? I'd like to ask you two questions with respect to that. First, can you describe for the assistance of the Commissioner the present makeup of the fleet with respect to concentration by corporate owners of licenses and or quota?
I didn't bring specific data with me to support an answer to that question, and perhaps if it's of interest, we could do that later. But in the salmon industry, depending on the fleet, there are substantial degrees of concentration already in some of the fleets. Example there would be in the seine fleet. Quite a number of the seine vessels are controlled by certain companies. Canadian Fishing Company is an example. The amounts of licenses held by various other interests vary in the other fleets. Another example might be the Northern Native Fishing Corporation, which holds substantial numbers of gillnet licenses in the salmon fleet. So there are a variety of concentrations, right down to sort of the individual owner-operator single license holders in the fleet.
And in the move to share-based management, what are some of the design options that could address that concern, or are there?
Well, in terms of how you set the program up, as I've stated before, you can look at a variety of different ways to address that. It really depends on one of the key elements, I guess, in designing the ITQs or quota management is the T part of that equation and how much transferability you might allow. Some have argued for full transferability as much as the marketplace would determine. Others have suggested there should be strong limits on that to maintain more of an owner-operator presence in the fleet. An example that we've looked at in one of our demonstrations in the Chinook fishery in the Northern Troll has been, they've explored a couple of different options, starting with a percentage of the TAC that could be accumulated by an individual vessel to address concerns about concentration of the quota. More recently, they've looked at having a hard limit on the amount of fish that can be caught before further reallocations can be made or other quota accumulated. So there's a variety of different ways to address those sorts of objectives in designing these kinds of programs.
Okay, thank you. This is Exhibit 481.
Thank you very much.
And Mr. Registrar, if we could then move to Exhibit 269. And if we could go to page 3 of 28. Mr. Grout, yesterday we spoke about this Pacific Fisheries Reform document from September 2005. I was wondering if you could perhaps just quickly explain for us the announcement from the Minister of the Fisheries back in April 14th, 2005, and how that announcement grounds this document.
The document you'll notice is dated September of 2005. So this document was produced after the minister announced a blueprint for change in the management of Pacific fisheries, called Pacific Fisheries Reform. The announcement was intended to address a number of continuing problems related to the sustainable management of fisheries resources, and in particular, well, it's a broader scope to the initiative here. The commercial salmon fishery was of particular note as well. Poor economic performance was cited, particularly in the salmon fishery. We've got aspirations from First Nations for increased economic access. So the paper was intended to flesh out the vision associated with the minister's earlier announcement.
All right, thank you. If we could then move to, Mr. Registrar, to Canada's binder, tab 9, and CAN 006616. And Mr. Grout, this is a letter dated August 13th, 2007, to the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board from Mr. Ron Katawaki. And could you identify this document and explain what it is?
This is a letter that was sent by our Director of Pacific Fisheries Reform at the time, Ron Katawaki, to Dave Barrett, who's the interim executive director at the time of the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board, providing further instruction for the SCORE process, which had been initiated with the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board to provide advice back to the department and the province and others on the reforms for the Pacific salmon fishery.
And at the bottom of the second paragraph, it sets out that DFO seeks to clarify or obtain advice on 4 questions. Could you clarify what those 4 questions are that DFO sought answers to?
The questions lay out the specific details relating to the feedback the department was expecting to receive in the SCORE report. The first was we were looking for advice on management for commercial salmon fleets that provides the flexibility of the fleets to respond to conservation objectives in an economically viable and sustainable manner. Also provides ability to fund associated fishery monitoring programs in the long run. We were also looking for a definition of catch shares for all commercial salmon fishing fleets to provide greater certainty and stability, and additional flexibility in structuring those fisheries, including the potential to have shares move between fleets. The third one was looking to have the framework and advice developed in a way that would be consistent with share-based fisheries conducted by First Nations, either under treaty or otherwise, where the parties have an equal opportunity to harvest their shares with similar rules, common conservation objectives. And then finally was a look for specific advice on what sorts of mechanisms you might use to allow those transfers of shares to occur, either between fleets or from the commercial fleets to the First Nations. And in this case, if there's a voluntary license retirement, which would retire commercial licenses and provide the shares associated with those to First Nations in a fair and transparent manner.
Just wondering if you could just comment briefly on whether it's important to have an integrated commercial fishery amongst First Nations and non-First Nations.
This is one of the key elements of the reform initiative we're looking at. One of the main reasons for that is to provide certainty and stability around the shares for all the participants in the fishery. We're also looking for ways to improve the conservation performance of these fisheries, and that could be through moving shares between fleets or from fleets to First Nations, potentially moving some of the harvest from mixed stock fishing areas into more inland areas, and also having the fisheries operate with similar rules and priority in terms of the commercial harvest.
Thank you. So, Mr. Registrar, if we could then go to Exhibit 472 at tab 35 in the Commission's binder.
Before moving forward, do you wish to have that last document marked?
Yes, I do. Thank you. I apologize.
Marked as Exhibit number 482.
Perhaps just to refresh us, if we could turn to page Roman numeral 3, the executive summary. If you could just refresh our memory as to the purpose of the executive summary here, what the summary is.
The summary is, the process, the SCORE report came from a process. It was facilitated by Diamond Management Consulting with the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board. The questions or the response to the report was looking for ways to provide advice to the department and the province beginning in the fall of 2006 in terms of supporting the further Pacific Fisheries Reform and the Pacific Integrated Commercial Fisheries Initiative, as well as addressing specific questions that the department had put to the group to provide advice back on.
All right. And does the score report, if we could turn to page 37 of 66, can you clarify what the result was with respect to area licensing through the score report? It should be page 28 in the black box,
Okay,
or in the
thank you.
bottom right, 37 of 66.
Okay, this there were a number of levels of discussion that the committee went through in wrestling with some of these questions. You can see in this table, they call it the decision matrix level was called level 2 around fleet shares on the far left-hand side. And then we have 3 columns of information here. And what ended up happening in the score process was essentially 2 divergent views, I guess, would be fair to say, emerged. One was characterized on the far right by those supporting a move to a defined share ITQ style of solution for the commercial salmon fishery, and then on the left, a group that was called the effective process group that was looking for more of a discussion process around how to design fisheries, but without a move necessarily to ITQs. In the middle, I think, was a helpful element in the report was where the group summarized their areas of consensus. So in answering your question, one piece of advice the department received was that that the gears in the areas, referring to the commercial licensing areas A through H, should be maintained, with area harvest committees taking the lead on creating solutions.
5th paragraph down starts, there's a philosophical gulf between the 2 groups, and perhaps you could just explain that so we have a sense of the outcome.
Well, it's a complicated discussion here, and maybe the report goes into some more of the details, but there were 2 clear groups that they managed to put together in the group during the process here. They were initially meeting all together and then realized they could make some progress with the 2 groups meeting separately. One of the groups, as I pointed out earlier, held the view that the commercial salmon industry needed to move towards a share-based management approach with ITQs as the potential tool to facilitate that. The other group was opposed to that. They wanted to see the active fishermen maintain the strong role in the fishery and have the ability to continue to do that, and using some of the existing mechanisms, for example, the annual review of shares for the various fleets, to make adjustments as required.
All right, well, thank you. Mr. Registrar, if we could then move, I'd like to just clarify the record as to, we're going to be moving to Exhibit 461. And Mr. Grout, can you just clarify, it's my understanding is that there have been 2 surveys of the commercial fleet with respect to their views on share-based management?
Yes, we did talk about those yesterday, but these were done in 2008. The first one was in April of 2008, and it was a survey requested by the area harvest committees from area B, D, and H in respect to the salmon scoping report here that was done by Davalin Pacific. So they were looking for advice from their harvest committees on that specific proposal.
And for the record, that's okay, so that's Exhibit 461 is the first one, and then the second survey, I believe, is Exhibit 468, Mr. Registrar. If we could have that pulled up. And Mr. Grout, if you could explain this second survey.
Well, the second survey was done in the fall of 2008. It was initiated by the department. Resource management specifically. I had a lead in developing the survey. We did the survey and sent the forms to all of the license holders in all 8 the commercial salmon fleets, asking for their advice on whether they would support their harvest committees working with the department on developing share-based management approaches for the specific stocks in their area. So there were, in the survey questions, an opportunity to answer yes or no for the major stocks that are harvested in each of the 8 commercial license areas. So there were differences among the stocks. This exhibit provides an overview of the survey results.
Right. And we went through that yesterday.
Yes.
Those results. I won't do that today, but I just wanted to clarify those were the 2 surveys that have taken place. I'd like to then move on to a discussion you had yesterday with Commission Council with respect to the allocation policy. And there you spoke about the allocation policy in 21 production areas in the allocation policy. And I thought it'd be helpful if you could explain where those 21 production areas are. And to help us out with that, Mr. Registrar, I was thinking that Exhibit 444 might be of assistance, which are the maps. And I understand that Appendix 4 to the IFMP, Exhibit 445, may also be of assistance. I'm not sure if we could do a split screen on that, or perhaps if everybody has their own maps, we don't need the maps up on the screen, and we just go to Appendix 4 of Exhibit 445. All right, so the question is, Mr. Grout, can you clarify where the 21 production areas are that are mentioned in the allocation policy?
Well, the 21 production areas relate to the intra-sector allocations for the commercial salmon fleet. And looking at the Appendix 4 document here, if we can move to the next page, Mr. Lunn. The linkage here with the maps is for each of these 21 production areas. So you see, starting with the linkages are to the area-based licenses for each of the commercial salmon fleets. So you can see in just linking this table then to the maps that are available, you can see one of the production areas for North Coast Sockeye refers to Area 1, 3 to 5, 101 to 105. And those would correspond to numbers on the maps for the Area A seine, Area C gillnet, and Area F troll. So this table can be used to match up with the map. So you see what, in this case it's sockeye from those areas being accessed by those 3 fleets. And you can compare that then to the maps that are available to see which areas. In this case, it's primarily related to Skeena and Nass sockeye.
All right, so just so we can do one example, just so we get that. For the Area A seine then, at Exhibit 444, we'd go to the Area seine map. And then we've got numbers 101 to 105. And is that, those are the numbers that are on this map then at...
That's correct. So for the area A seine and the Area C gillnet, they're primarily harvesting in portions of areas 3, 4, or 5. For Skeena and Nass sockeye, there's specific regulations that would be announced on which sub-areas would be open within there. 101 to 105 would primarily be referring to where the Area F troll fleet might take or access the North Coast sockeye in some years.
Okay, thank you. And with respect to the allocation policy, could you then, what are the challenges then of using area licensing with the coast-wide allocation policy?
That's been one of the key challenges with implementing the policy for the commercial salmon fleets. If you recall from yesterday's discussion, we are working towards allocations on a coast-wide basis by gear type. So 40% for the seine, 38% gillnet, 22% troll. In terms of the allocations that roll up into those, the policy is blind to where the harvest might occur in each of those areas. So to use an example for the seine fleet, it's unlikely, but you could have a situation where one of the seine fleets, either A in the north or B in the south, just because of the harvests available in their area, are harvesting the lion's share of the seine fleet coast-wide share, and the other seine fleet is not.
And that's because of the location of the salmon.
That's correct.
Right.
So you can have quite substantive imbalances between the fleets that are making up a given share, either the gillnet, seine, or troll.
And so the location of the salmon migrating is complicates this matter.
Area-based licensing has restricted the areas where each of the different fleets can access their fish. So that's certainly one of the challenges.
And then can you explain how you work to correct imbalances in the coast-wide shares?
One of the things we do, and I explained the negotiation that occurs with the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board in April of each year yesterday, what we try and do is look at adjustments to the percentage shares for individual fleets, or each of the 8 fleets in the areas they're harvesting, to see if we can try and iron out or come closer to the 40, 38, 22% target. The reality is you tend to, or to make balance large differences, there's only a few key spots in this matrix where you can actually do that. And the reason for that is the troll fleets, area F and G, are primarily harvesting Chinook in the aggregate abundance-based management areas outlined under the Pacific Salmon Treaty. Those Chinook can't be moved to other fleets. Those are high-value Chinook, so those have in recent years inflated the troll share above the 22% and made it challenging to balance. In addition, Chinook are more valuable than sockeye, so you need a lot of sockeye to balance out those sorts of imbalances. If you recall, the Chinook equivalents were upwards of 5 sockeye equaling 1 Chinook. On the other hand, you can have fleets, all 3 fleets that have access to pink salmon, but pink salmon are worth far less in sockeye equivalents than sockeye. Right. So to try and balance using pink salmon is also extremely challenging, because some gear types have trouble catching a lot of pinks. For example, the troll fleet isn't going to catch nearly as many pinks as a seine fishery, and you need a lot more pinks harvested to fix imbalances. So what that ends up leaving us with in a lot of cases is trying to balance using sockeye, and in places where all of the fleets have access to sockeye. And one of the particular spots where we spent a lot of time in recent years negotiating is the fleet shares for Fraser River sockeye, given that the gillnet, seine, and troll fleets all have access to this species in the south.
Okay, so you're balancing all of the species out, all the salmon species together, and then the sockeye salmon is a key salmon because of the ability for the various fleets to have access to it.
Yes, through a combination of fleets having access, relatively good value for sockeye in terms of balancing across the fleets, and in past years, greater abundance of sockeye to actually do that balancing with.
Right, and when you don't have sockeye, it makes balancing even more difficult.
It makes it extremely challenging when your preseason expectations are low for sockeye in particular.
My final question on allocation policy, it might be of assistance if you could use the maps and point to where the production areas are, where most of the Fraser River sockeye is caught, so we can know where to focus our attention.
Fraser sockeye can be harvested by all 5 of the southern fleets. So starting with the Area B seine fleet, they're primarily harvesting, and I went over this yesterday, up in Area 12 and 13, also in Area 29 off the mouth of the river, and somewhat in Area 20. So that's the seine fleet.
Okay.
We've got the D and E gillnet fleets. Area D is primarily harvesting in 12 and 13. And so they're reliant on Fraser sockeye diverting in through the northern entrance here around Vancouver Island to access those fish. Next, if we could do Area E. Area E, again, is primarily harvesting in Area 29 and in the Fraser River itself for Fraser sockeye. And then finally, the 2 troll fleets. Area G troll has not harvested sockeye in a number of years. But in some years, they have had an allocation of Fraser sockeye that they've been able to harvest on the west coast or up around the top end of Vancouver Island. And then finally, the Area H troll is limited to the inside areas, primarily 12, 13, but also in 18 and 29 for accessing Fraser sockeye.
Okay, thank you. With respect to moving on to share-based management, Kekern recommended that in share-based management it may be helpful to set 2 targets for each fisherman, 1 a percentage of the TAC, and 2 a bycatch limit. And he commented that having a bycatch limit would increase responsible fishing. I'd like your views on that suggestion.
In share-based management programs that have been implemented, particularly in our demonstration fisheries for Fraser sockeye, the focus has been on specifying an individual share of the catch. In catch share programs elsewhere, shares of the bycatch have also been specified as well, and the groundfish fishery in BC is maybe an example of where that's been done. There would be some challenges with, I think, well, first off, I think it's something that it could be effective in assisting with management. It's not going to solve all of the problems with salmon. There are challenges, especially with species where we don't have stock assessment information to either provide a forecast of abundance or an in-season assessment of abundance to specify a quantitative share of the bycatch that you could manage to, because you run the risk of setting the wrong level.
Right.
And if you set a level that's too high and the return of that particular species is low, you risk having much more bycatch than you would really like.
All right, so depending on the situation and depending on the data, it may be of assistance.
It's certainly something that's worthwhile to look at as we move forward, but I just wanted to point out that it's not something that's going to be of immediate utility for a number of our populations where bycatch is an issue.
Tuesday, Mr. Eidsvik, counsel for the Southern Eel-Gillnetters and Area B Harvest Committee, asked Mr. Brown a question with respect to the importance of selective fishing. And I'd like to just read this question to you, and that'd be my last question. And this is from I'm just reading from the transcript, February 22nd, page 89, lines 33 through 47. So the question was, so if I could sum this up then, would it be fair to say that the selective fishing program has absolutely nothing to do with Fraser River sockeye, with the exception of how we harvest cultists? And then Mr. Brown's testimony was, what I'm trying to say, and I'm not sure I'm doing it very well, Commissioner, is I'm not against selective fishing. I think it's probably notionally a good idea, but it will not be something that will save the day here. It is something that looks to me like has become a make-work project for some individuals in the DFO, and of course they have a vested interest in making it appear all more important. However, there is really no need in order to properly manage Fraser River sockeye, which is what we're dealing with here, to depart radically from the old traditional methods of harvest. I'd like your views on that question and answer.
Well, I would respectfully disagree with some of the points that are raised there. I think as it relates to the harvest of sockeye, the department's moving in a direction where we're increasingly taking into account the sustainability of the fishery and maintenance of the conservation units that contribute to Fraser River sockeye. The wild salmon policy provides clear direction on maintaining those conservation units. We also have the obligations potentially under the Species at Risk Act. And I would note that a number of populations, including cultus sockeye, Sackinaw sockeye, and interior Fraser coho, have been designated as endangered by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. They weren't listed under the Species at Risk Act, but there's clearly a commitment from the department to maintain these populations and try and recover them. So it's an extremely important part of the management approach that we're taking. In terms of the harvest of those populations, there's considerable overlap among the conservation units in the Fraser sockeye fishery. And what we're trying to do in setting the escapement objectives for Fraser Sockeye is take into account the effects of our harvest rules that are specified at a management unit level. And by that I mean for early steward, early summer, summer and late run, but that take into account the potential impacts on the conservation units within those. A second point I would make on selective fishing in relation to Fraser Sockeye relates to other species. And interior Fraser coho is an example I've used on a number of occasions in terms of managing our fisheries to avoid impacts on those populations. We've also had cases, though, where we've had very low abundance of Fraser Sockeye, and we've tried to have fisheries for Fraser Sockeye during periods when we'd normally be fishing, or we've tried to have fisheries for other species, for example, Fraser pink salmon, during time periods when we'd normally be fishing for sockeye. So we've also been exploring ways that we can have selective harvest of pink salmon as an example, while avoiding impacts on sockeye because total allowable harvest has not been identified or it's extremely small. And 2009 was an example of those sorts of considerations.
All right, thank you very much. Those are all my questions.
Mr. Commissioner, Mr. Tyzek is next on the list.
For the record, Mr. Commissioner Boris Tyzek, TYZUK for the province of British Columbia. Mr. Grout, I'd just like to follow up with a couple of questions on selective fisheries and then one on SBMs in general. It's our understanding that from the evidence we've had before that there was a quite active selective fisheries program from 1998 to 2002. Since then, there hasn't been very much in terms of funding. My understanding, and there is no person who's the head of that. Yet, yesterday you were asked the question of who's responsible for implementing selective fisheries, and you made an answer. You talked about the salmon team, and then was it the Fraser River panel implementation team? You think you could expand a bit on that, please?
Yes, I'm not sure the exact wording that's been entered in the record, but I meant to indicate the Fraser River Integrated Management Team,
Okay.
which is a departmental group including our fishery managers for all of the various areas. It includes the Fraser Panel Chair, members of the Tech Committee. That group also quite often will meet with the Canadian caucus of the Fraser Panel, so the Canadian representatives on the Fraser Panel, to discuss ways that they might implement management plans, especially at times when there's a need to fish selectively.
Okay, but but in this, is there any one person who has this, is responsible for the policy itself, or is the policy just like a bunch of other policies you may have?
Well, the point I was trying to make yesterday is that the policy, as far as I understand, does not have one individual assigned to it. It's meant to, or it guides how the department does all of its work. So our managers in designing fisheries are aware of the elements of the selective fishing policy, and we're trying to implement that as we design our programs.
So is there anyone who's responsible for ensuring that implementation? Is there anyone who's going to oversee this to ensure that the managers are doing this, or is this something that just kind of happens and you hope that it's dealt with?
No, I think the specific provisions that we're looking at implementing in as far as selective fishing are concerned are rolled up and included as part of the development of the Integrated Fishery Management Plan each year. So specific provisions for the various different fisheries are outlined there, as well as the considerations for bycatch and the measures we may need to take at different times of the year. So the annual implementation of the selective fishing policy is included in the Integrated Fishery Management Plan as far as the guidance on how we're going to implement our fisheries and the selective measures that may go there. Included in that process is a post-season review where we can look at the performance of some of these activities.
Okay. Is there any work that you know being done through you or your team on development of these techniques or any new techniques?
I alluded to a couple of things yesterday. One is I thought it would be helpful if the Commissioner was aware of ongoing research that's occurring, and I referred to the NSERC research that's being done with departmental staff, some of our science staff, UBC and Carleton researchers looking at salmon migrations and selective or effects of fisheries on the migration success of sockeye. Our DFO managers have also been involved in providing advice to that group in terms of what's specifically important. We've also been looking at are working with users and harvesters and providing the objectives we're trying to achieve and allowing them to come up with ways that they might have their fisheries while being consistent with the objectives laid out.
Okay, thank you. You gave an example yesterday, and I'm just sort of learning about fisheries during the course of this hearing, but you gave an example of a 3-hour opening in the Fraser to try to catch some sockeye. I said it was about 30,000. They ended up catching about 45,000. Now, was that Fraser River gill netters?
Yes, the example I gave there was for the an Area E gillnet opening in the Fraser River, and I believe that was somewhere around August 1st, if I recall correctly.
It was 3 hours. So those gill netters, am I correct in assuming that they would have to have revival boxes on deck, on board?
That's correct.
Okay, so in 3 hours, if they have that rush, what likelihood would they be using those revival boxes? Because
that might be a better question directed to our enforcement staff. I can't provide you specific information on compliance levels.
Okay, but if there's a 3-hour opening, there's a very concentrated period of time to try to catch fish. Our understanding is using revival boxes or techniques like that takes some time. Is that a fair comment?
Again, I'm not a gillnet fisherman. I have been on vessels where the crew has been very efficient at getting fish into the revival boxes. I have been on vessels where the bycatch has started to fill up in the revival boxes, and issues around releasing the fish from the revival box once they've recovered while the fishery is still ongoing, and concerns that they may be recaptured, and some of those sorts of issues. That's the level of my experience.
But the understanding we had is that selective techniques such as this take more time. And in a 3-hour fishery, isn't the main focus to try to get as many fish as you can because you've only got 3 hours?
I think I would agree with your general assessment there.
Thanks. The last question I have is, you were speaking of how you're implementing shared base management, and the evidence you gave is that you were trying to work with willing fleets and First Nations. But is there any sort of a time frame you have, like 3 years, 5 years, more? Because you're talking about willing fleets. If the fleets aren't willing, and from the tables that we got, some are and some aren't. So is there some sort of general time frame you have in mind here?
In terms of the moving ahead with some of the reforms, there's a number of challenges that have been identified, as well as philosophical opposition to trying some of these different approaches, particularly around individual transferable quotas in some of the areas. So the department's been trying to move ahead in an incremental way to this point with willing fleets. I don't have, if you're asking for a firm deadline on when this has to occur, I can't give you that.
No, but I guess that given what you said, you're trying to work with willing fleets. At some point, if people aren't willing or they aren't split, does that mean that you're not going to go ahead with it, or would you require some sort of direction from on high to say, we want this to happen?
I will say, in terms of the work I do each year, when we send out the requests for projects with the fleets, we are continuing to try and talk with the harvest committees, in particular for fleets that haven't moved ahead, and try and explore ways or in fisheries where we might do this. That might entail trying to develop a project for perhaps a fishery that's going to be a lot smaller or less important to the fleet to start, so we can learn something about it. I referred to a small pool fishery that we contemplated for Area E in 2009 and 10. It wasn't going to be for a large harvest of Chinook, with sockeye being their most important harvest. So we're continuing to try and explore ways we might learn something about doing it and perhaps gain some traction with the fleets around trying other things.
Okay, so I guess what I'm hearing you say is there is no real time frame. You could be in the same position five years from now. So 10 years after you were going down this road, you could still be trying to work with fleets to try to do something on the present basis. Is that fair?
Well, I mean,
I'm not trying. I'm just trying to get a sense of it, because if you're working with willing fleets and they're not willing or not much is coming, then there's some question about whether the policy is going to be implemented in any significant way.
well, maybe I'll answer it this way. In other fisheries that have moved to share-based approaches, it typically has not been a snap where it's occurred overnight, and there's been a substantial amount of time that's taken in some of these to work out all the rules and design options around how you might do it. I think for the salmon demonstrations we've done, we've had a number of years with projects contemplated, and I'd say 2010 was probably the first fair trial on a substantive abundance of harvest. In years previous, we hadn't done a whole lot, at least on Fraser sockeye, so I think we still have some things to learn in moving ahead.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Mr. Tyzik has the accuracy prize. He asked for 10 minutes. He was exactly 10. I have Mr. Harrison for the Conservation Coalition next.
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. Good morning, Mr. Grout. My name is Judah Harrison for the record, Harrison. And I represent the Conservation Coalition, which is a number of not-for-profits and an individual focused on conservation of salmon. I'm going to be very brief. Yesterday and just now, you touched on impediments to share-based management absent area-wide adoption or fleet-wide adoption. So yesterday you were talking about Area F and how within the fleet you had granted science licenses and allowed some parties within the fleet to do share-based management and others not to. Then on Tuesday we heard evidence from Ryan McEachern, a commercial fisherman, that a group of fishermen in his area, himself included, would like to adopt share-based management. And they'd also like to pool their resources. But under the current regulatory structure, they cannot do so. So my question to you is, are there valid and sensible reasons for restricting and limiting adoption of share-based management and pooling resources to fleet-wide, or requiring fleet-wide adoption of this?
Maybe you could rephrase your question. I'm trying to understand specifically what you're asking me to address.
I guess I'm asking, well, Area F and the experiment that you touched on yesterday, where within the fleet, certain members were allowed to practice or do demonstration fisheries of share-based management and others were not. And I believe you said that they were allowed to do so through the use of science licenses or scientific licenses.
That's correct.
And then from what I understand, that was changed, including through the LaRocque decision. And now, if a fleet wants to adopt share-based management, or if a commercial fisherman wants to adopt share-based management, they must do so only if their entire fleet agrees. Is that correct?
Yes, that's the direction we've given to the harvest committees in terms of how the department would like to move forward with share-based management.
So then my question is, can you explain the rationale for not allowing certain members or for requiring fleet-wide agreement to such a process? Can you explain rationale why a commercial fisherman like Ryan McEachern, if he wants to pool his resources or adopt share-based management, requires fleet-wide approval?
Okay, the challenge stems from the direction that we're moving, which is that in implementing these demonstration fisheries, we're requiring the commercial license to be used. And if we use the Area D example, we don't have a way to use the existing commercial license to create essentially two separate groups of individuals, one group that might want to fish competitively in a derby-style fishery, and one group that would like to fish to a quota without doing things that the fleet would not be willing to accept. For example, restricting within their Area D fishing area, which areas the derby group might be able to fish in and which group the ITQ group might fish in. That hasn't been desirable. And so the main problem is when we use a variation order to open the fishery, all of the license holders are eligible to go out and participate in that opening.
So I guess I just wanted to hit on the structural impediment to that, and whether you think that's good, or whether you think it would be better to allow flexibility as existed before the Larocque decision.
Well, there's two ways you can think about that. One is when we were able to split the fleets up in the past, it allowed us to experiment and do a comparison of the two management regimes at the same time, and perhaps gain some buy-in for how you might move ahead with doing that. On the other hand, it stretches the department's resources to try and do that, because then your managers have to manage a derby-style competitive fishery, and the requirements there around managing the inputs, doing overflights to assess effort, and those sorts of things they would normally do to manage that fishery, in addition to managing the share-based fishery as well, which the department's required to, or has been managing the reallocation process, issuing amendments and that sort of thing. So there's pros and cons associated with doing that.
Be effective, share-based management requires robust catch monitoring. Is that correct?
That is correct. We're providing a specific share to individuals or groups of individuals, and you need to have trust among the individuals, as well as from the regulator side, that the specified catch amounts are being adhered to.
And would you say that the current monitoring requirements in the commercial salmon fishery are adequate to adopt a share-based management system? And if helpful, I would like it if you can compare and contrast with the monitoring requirements in groundfish fisheries like halibut.
Well, I'll start with the first part of your question and maybe compare the salmon fishery. So starting with a commercial fishery in one of the areas that has not gone to a demonstration, so a commercial derby-style fishery, for example, Area D or E, gillnet fleets, they have a requirement to hail in their catch and complete logbook requirements as part of their conditions of license. Managers, in assessing the catch from the opening, are essentially using effort profiles and information on catches from individual vessels to come up with a fleet-wide estimate of the harvest, but there's not a census in effect in terms of counting every last fish. And in the demonstration fisheries, where we've had a defined share specified in licenses, we've had a requirement of mandatory landing and dockside monitoring by an independent service provider. So the fish are essentially counted or weighed off against the quota amounts on their licenses. I'm not an expert on everything that's occurring in the groundfish fishery, but they do have the dockside monitoring requirements and validation with the independent service provider. They also have additional components around electronic monitoring while the vessels are at sea, associated with bycatch and other provisions there.
Okay, thank you very much. My final question is really share-based management, a more flexible fishery, selective fishing. In your opinion, are these essential tools and essential things that need to happen in order to adhere or meet the goals of the wild salmon policy?
I think it's certainly consistent with the goals we've got with the wild salmon policy. The vision laid out in Pacific Fishery Reform in terms of the move towards share-based management would certainly provide or enable the fleets to meet some of those commitments around implementing the wild salmon policy, especially around the fleets being more self-reliant, able to self-adjust, We've had improved performance in terms of achieving the catch objectives in those fisheries. We've had those fleets also able to contribute to the cost of the catch monitoring and validation of their fish, which has been a concern and an impediment in some of the competitive fisheries. There's also elements around a share-based approach that would allow you to make transfers of salmon to inland areas where you might be able to harvest more selectively, and in particular avoid some conservation units that might be weaker than others.
Mr. Rosenblum for areas D and B.
Yes, Don Rosenblum appearing on behalf of Area D, Gillnet, Area B, Sainer. Mr. Grout, thank you very much for answering the questions that I have for you today. I want to start following up on a question that, in fact, the Commissioner asked you just before Mr. Timberg commenced his examination in chief yesterday, and I want to refer you to the exchange between the Commissioner and yourself, and it related to a question by the Commissioner about co-management, concepts of co-management. And I would ask Mr. Lund to pull out yesterday's transcript, February the 23rd, page 71. And starting at line 34, and I'll allow Mr. Lund, I didn't give him any notice that I would be doing this, so.
It'll be just a moment for yesterday's transcript.
No problem. Thank you. And basically, while that's being done, Mr. Grout, I want to read out to you the Commissioner's question to you and your reply. And maybe, again, I'm the only one that doesn't understand this, but it begged to me a whole series of issues that, in fact, should very much be the focus of this inquiry. Looking at vision and the future and where it all goes. And so I wanted you to expand upon the response that you provided to the Commissioner last day. Mr. Lund?
Yes, the page number.
February 23rd, page 71. I apologize, Mr. Lund, for not giving you notice, but I only just got the transcript by email, as all of us did.
Me too. That's why it took
Thank you.
longer. Thank you.
So here we have it, and it's at page 71, and it is line 34. And at line 34, I believe the Commissioner says, and when you talk about co-management in that topic, are you talking about some sort of formalized management scheme? I'm still not clear as to what is meant by co-management under that particular. You may not be able to enlighten me on this because it's not your document, but you answer, I think to go back a little bit, the discussion paper is intended to outline a vision for where we might go in the future and lay out some of the ways we might get there. We're looking at an increased role in co-management, but it hasn't laid out the specific framework for how that will occur. Some of the other exhibits with the white paper, for example, are trying to further describe what these things might look like. But as I stated, they're still in a draft stage at this point, full stop. And the Commissioner thanked you for your response, and I thank you for your response. But because this Royal Commission is in part to have a vision into the future, is not only looking at the past, can you fill in, from your perspective, what you imagine a co-management, a more developed co-management system or schematic might be as we look into the future 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Is that a question you can answer?
Well, I can take a shot at it. In terms of a response, I might point out that in some of the discussion relates to the exhibit number 269, which is the discussion paper on Pacific fisheries reform, and I think some of my thinking aligns with some of the thinking that's laid out in that paper.
And what year was that paper approximately?
This was September of 2005.
I'm sorry, thank you, yes. Sorry.
And so in terms of your question around co-management, I see the vision in terms of a way forward is related to the incentives around the fisheries. So it's a movement from an input-controlled fishery where the incentive is, as a fisherman, is to go out and catch as much as you can during that opening, to one where there's a clearly defined share and there's some certainty and stability around that. And then the harvesters can start thinking around how they might add value to their share, perhaps reduce costs, working with the department on ways they might do some of those things. So I think it's providing the incentives and then providing an opportunity for a much more active role of the harvesters to work with not only with the department, but also amongst themselves and finding ways that they can access their shares. For example, if they're in a year where they don't happen to have access to a particular population that they have a share of for whatever reason, and finding ways that they can self-adjust and become more self-reliant in moving their shares around themselves.
And I assume that your response is totally within the context of a share-based management system.
That's the vision and the direction in terms of where we're headed.
Yes. And in the absence of moving in that direction, share-based management, you do not see further co-management initiatives that might be taken in the fishery?
Well, I don't know if I'd state it entirely that way. The department's continuing to provide resources to build on its co-management processes. There's specific funding outlined as part of the Pacific Integrated Commercial Fisheries Initiative around co-management and doing work there, especially the role of First Nations in the process around economic opportunity and commercial harvest. But we're also looking to work with the fleets in an open and transparent way in terms of how we move ahead. So I think I would expect that to continue and broaden.
Thank you. I now want to come to this very complex subject of the Mifflin Plan, divvying up the coast in terms of areas, and the licensing and the allocation issues. And in my examination of the panel of harvesters on Tuesday, and others, including Commission Counsel, raised the issues that arose in terms of allocation in the context of a coast-wide allocation, and yet your licensing being within areas or North Coast, South Coast, and so on. And did you ever have the opportunity since Tuesday to read the transcript of the evidence given by the harvesters on Tuesday?
No, unfortunately, I did not.
I don't fault you for it. I thank you. Just to give you an example of the evidence, because I'm going to be asking you a series of questions about how DFO and how the government intends to rationalize the current problems that you're confronting with the Mifflin Plan and yet a coast-wide allocation. I was questioning my client, Mr. McEachran, who is Area D Gillnet, and I'm speaking of the date of the 22nd of this February, which would have been Tuesday. I have on my screen here page 58, and I believe line 2. And there was a whole preamble to this exchange between myself and Mr. McEachran, and it was speaking, many of these witnesses were speaking of the dysfunctionality of the current situation, of the imposition of Mifflin, and yet it's the department maintaining still a coast-wide allocation, and that's the best I can do in articulating the general theme of some of the evidence that was given on Tuesday. At line 2, or line 3, I asked Mr. McEachran, yes, in appreciating that there is this unfairness, would you say that the Mifflin Plan was implemented without appreciating the problems that arise from it with allocation? Mr. McEachran answers, I guess I'm very happy to say that when the Mifflin Plan was being engineered, it wasn't part of the political process yet at the time. In fact, I didn't start fishing my own boat until I was 15. Sorry, that's not important. So going on at line 13, so my understanding from speaking to the various participants in the Mifflin Plan was that that was a chapter that never got finished. excuse me, and my impression was that there was always an intention to deal with the coast-wide allocation issue, but it never happened. And then we went on for there. Do you generally agree, Mr. Grout, that this is unfinished business, that we have the implemented Mifflin plan concept, yet the allocation protocols, if I can put it that way, have not kept pace with the fact that Mifflin has been implemented?
Well, I can't speak to directly the Mifflin plan itself, but I will say in terms of the allocation framework, there's quite a bit of dissatisfaction with the use of the coast-wide shares and what sorts of imbalances might occur among the 8 area license types as a result of trying to work towards that coast-wide balance. The department has sought advice from the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board on how we might move forward with that through the SCORE process, and we've got some evidence on that that's already been provided. We're also, I'd say in answer to your question, it continues to be an element that the department would like to see more progress on. We did touch on the fact yesterday that as part of the Pacific Salmon Treaty mitigation, there is some funding available for modernizing the commercial salmon allocation framework there.
Thank you. And yes, I want to speak to that in a follow-up. But just before doing so, in your response to me, you spoke of, yes, there is dissatisfaction with the current situation. Is that dissatisfaction not only that of my clients and the harvesters, but is there dissatisfaction with DFO with the problems that we're speaking about here?
I think the department would like to see some changes there as well. That are more consistent with the vision in terms of moving forward with Pacific fisheries reform. To use a specific example there, one of the things that we think is an important element is providing certainty and stability. The current framework provides certainty around what the coast-wide gear type shares would be around seine, gillnet, and troll, but there's uncertainty around what the area and gear shares are within any given year, and it can change from year to year, and that creates uncertainty, which and uncertainty takes away from the initiative or direction to creating certainty and stability and allowing the fishermen to make longer term plans for managing their businesses.
So do you believe that DFO would endorse the concerns that fishers are generally expressing about the status quo?
That's a pretty broad question in terms of endorsing the concerns. I'd have to know specifically which ones you're wanting me to address before I could reply accurately.
I guess let me put it this way. DFO would endorse an aggressive direction to review and reform the allocation concepts post-Mifflin.
As I stated before, that is an element of work that the department feels there's more to be done there. There's some funding to do that as part of the Pacific Salmon Treaty mitigation.
Which leads to this question, why is the funding coming from the Americans? I'm familiar with the fact that this, I believe $5 million is from the Pacific Salmon Mitigation Treaty arrangements and something to do with litigation with the troll fleet, if I understand it correctly. But why do the Americans end up funding this particular domestic project of ours relating to allocation? Can you just explain that to me?
Well, I wasn't, Paul McGilvery is probably best placed to answer specific questions around the Pacific Salmon Treaty, but maybe just to correct one statement you made, the amount of money provided was $30 million US to Canada as one part of the renewed provisions of the Pacific Salmon Treaty. In the so-called fishing chapters of the treaty, Chinook was one of the specific items of active negotiation in the last round when the renewal was done in 2008. Substantive conservation concerns around Chinook had been identified by the parties, and they were negotiating reductions in the Chinook harvests in the large offshore Chinook fishing areas that I referred to as aggregate abundance-based management areas. There was a reduction in Southeast Alaska and a reduction on the west coast of Vancouver Island as part of the treaty provisions. As part of that package, $30 million US was provided to Canada for I can't remember the exact wording here.
Forgive me, Mr.
program
Brown,
to
I don't want to
mitigate
interrupt you,
the
except
commercial
I'm
fishing.
I don't think any of, I apologize, but I don't think it's terribly important right now to go into all the details of that 30 million. It's a portion of it has been designated to fund what I'll call the reforming of our allocation system. Isn't that not correct?
Mr.
Have you
Commissioner,
not testified to that?
I'd like to allow the witness to answer the question. You asked a question, and he's answering it.
Well, then I don't want my learned friend, Mr. Martland, to tell me I'm over time. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
My question simply is this. A portion of the settlement that came out of the Pacific Salmon Mitigation Treaty arrangements, as I understand it, is money designated for an initiative within DFO to reform your allocation concepts.
I'm sorry, I don't like to disagree with Mr. Rosenblum, but that wasn't the question. The question was, how is it that 30 million, corrected from 5 million, 30 million was provided by the Americans to fund a domestic program?
Well, if that was my question, Mr. Roseman was not interested in the 30 million. I am aware of a settlement, and I know my learned friend is very familiar with this particular matter. I'm simply asking, there is a portion of that money which has been designated for a review of the allocation system, correct?
$1 million approximately of that money was set aside for modernizing the commercial salmon allocation framework.
My question is, why are we being funded by the Americans for this particular project? Why has DFO not commenced this review some time ago and funded it out of their own pocket?
Part of the impetus for having the work done on the commercial allocation framework here is the bulk of the funding in the PST mitigation of approximately 29 million is to be used for a troll buyback. And the work around the allocation framework recognizes that the troll fleets are combined together in the coast-wide framework. There's potential for area reselection among or between areas in the future. And so really the work was specifically focused around what the implications are there for the buyback on the commercial allocation framework. So we thought it was important to include that as part of this program.
I know we're about for coffee to have coffee break, but if I can just ask you one last question before the break. This funding that has been provided, is DFO contributing money directly to the program too?
Not that I'm aware of.
And when this funding runs out, what I'll call the American funding, where are we at? Is DFO intending to budget to pursue and carry on with this initiative?
I can't provide a specific answer to that question.
And so may I ask you this, are you uncertain, sir, whether there is any certainty, or you can bring confidence to this commission, that this program of review will in fact be pursued and taken to implementation?
Well, I think your question presumes or would have to have a presumption of what the outcome of the work might be. And at this point, we haven't started with the work. So I can't say specifically what might occur, what might result from that, or what might be done afterwards.
So you can't say to my clients with any confidence as to when there might be reform of this particular aspect of it, of harvest management?
I can't provide the specific timelines on how that program might be delivered today.
Even vague timelines?
Well, I would expect it would be in the next year or two, but I can't give you the specific date when we're going to start.
That might be the appropriate time for the break. Thank you.
Just before the break, Mr. Rosenblum, just so I understand the context, words like program are being used and so on. I just want to make sure I understand exactly what is within this modernization framework that you've been addressing questions to the witness about. I apologize. I may be just not following where you're going, but if the witness could just explain what is within this $1 million ambit and the so-called modernization program, what exactly are you talking about?
And who's doing it?
Well, the specific questions around this are probably better addressed to somebody in our policy unit that was involved in the development of the program. So that's why I'm not able to provide all of the specific details for you around timelines and specific elements here.
And as Commission Counsel, can they tell us whether we can look forward to a witness coming forward that would be more appropriate to answer these questions?
I'd like to speak with Mr. Rosenblum at the break, and we can pick up on this. Thank you.
I do note that Paul McGilvery will be back for the final panel, and Mr. Grout has mentioned that he's the person.
That final panel's pretty late in the day, but I'm in the hands of the Commission. Thank you.
I just want to make sure I understand, Mr. Grout. You've been addressing for the last couple of days questions with respect to the shared base management program. You just referred a moment or so ago to exhibit, I'll get the number for you, sir, 269?
Yes.
That's the Fisheries Reform Program. So in your answers to Mr. Rosenblum, you've made reference to those topics. But now you say you can't really address or answer questions regarding, using your word, a program. I'm just trying to understand how I relate what you just said to everything else you've said about the hopes and desires and wishes of the DFO with respect to shared base management. Is that not part of this program you're talking about? When you talk about modernization of the allocation policy, what exactly are you addressing?
If I follow your question, or maybe I'm not exactly following your question.
All right. Let me just see if I can myself do a better job. I apologize to you. I've not been very articulate about this. It started off discussing the Mifflin plan and post-Mifflin. And then Mr. Rosenblum moved to this $30 million fund, and you've addressed $1 million set aside for a modernization program. And I'm just trying to understand how the modernization program you've mentioned relates to everything else you've been talking about in terms of your vision for the reform of the fishery.
Okay, well, one of the elements of the it ties back to the allocation policy and how the area gear shares are set out and currently negotiated on an annual basis. There's also provisions described in the allocation policy of an example for what you might do if licenses are bought back and removed from a fleet. As it relates to the Pacific Salmon Treaty Mitigation Funding, the funding or a program has been announced by the government for a buyback of licenses from the troll fleet. The department's recognized that doing that may have some impacts on the allocation framework itself. And so the part of the program there was specifically to deal with the impacts of the buyback, or the potential impacts of the buyback on the allocation framework itself. There may be elements of those discussions that are more can be discussed consistent with the vision that's laid out in the Pacific Fisheries Reform here, with providing certainty and stability around the shares, and those may also be able to be addressed as part of that.
Do you anticipate that some of the problems that you could imagine that my clients speak about and have testified about here would be ironed out in the course of this review?
That would be my expectation as one of the potential outcomes.
Thank you. I have further questions, but obviously after the break. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grout. Thank you very much.
Hearing will now recess for 15 minutes.